right, it's recording. Achievement can expose what ambition was hiding. I think achievement can become one of the most revealing places in a person's life, not because success is dangerous, not because ambition is wrong, and certainly not because reaching a dream is something to fear, but because achievement has a way of exposing what ambition was quietly carrying long before we ever reached the destination. If you've ever accomplished something you once believed would change your life, only to discover that it didn't quiet everything inside you, this conversation is for you. Maybe you earned the degree, maybe you built the business, maybe you got married, maybe you finally bought the house, landed the position, the promotion, or achieved the goal you spent years working toward. From the outside, everything suggested that life had finally become what you hoped it would be. But somewhere underneath the celebration, another question began whispering, why don't I feel the way I thought I would? I don't I don't think we talk about that question nearly enough. Our culture is remarkably good at teaching us how to pursue achievement. From an early age, we're taught to set goals, work hard, stay disciplined, and keep moving forward. We celebrate ambition because ambition often produces extraordinary things. It builds careers, earns degrees, creates businesses, change families, and opens the door what that once seemed impossible, or doors actually. I believe ambition is a beautiful thing. It has certainly been a part of my own life. What I don't think we talk about is what happens after the achievement. We rarely ask what success reveals once the applause fades. We don't spend much time asking why some people finally reach the life they've been working toward, only to find themselves emotionally exhausted, strangely unsettled, or quietly wondering why accomplishment didn't answer the questions they thought it would. Instead, we often assume something must be wrong. Maybe we weren't grateful enough. Maybe we chose the wrong goal. Maybe we should simply set a bigger one. So we keep chasing another milestone, another promotion, another breakthrough, another version of the future that promises to finally make everything inside of us feel complete. For a long time, I believed some version of that story myself. Years ago, there was one dream that I organized nearly everything I was doing, getting into UCLA. That dream wasn't simply about attending a university. It represented possibility. It represented expansion. It represented becoming the kind of person I wasn't sure I was capable of becoming. For years, UCLA existed almost like another country in my imagination, a place that belonged to people who were somehow smarter, more qualified, more prepared than I believed myself to be. And long before I ever submitted an application, I had already divided the world into two groups: the people who belonged there and me. Then something extraordinary happened. 4 days before my 24th birthday, I opened my admissions decision and discovered I had been accepted. I can still remember holding my laptop with the letter open in my hands. I can still remember that email. It felt impossible and tangible at the same time. The school I had rehearsed in my imagination has suddenly become real. And for a while, I thought that acceptance letter was proof of something much greater than admission, or much bigger, rather. It felt like proof that conviction mattered, proof that imagination mattered, proof that old assumptions could be outrun, and in many ways it was. But what I couldn't see then was that achieving a version and inhabiting it are not always the same experience. I had spent years imagining the moment I would get in. I had imagined opening the letter, walking across the campus, graduating, moving out of my mother's house, building the life I had dreamed about. What I had not imagined was who I needed to become while I was there. Looking back, that distinction feels incredibly important. I had prepared myself for achievement. I had not prepared myself for belonging. There is a difference. When I attended the Los Angeles Film School before transferring to UCLA, I found myself imagining friendships before they existed. I imagined conversations with classmates from around the world. I imagined creative collaboration, laughter, growth, and a community that felt expansive. Without realizing it, I was rehearsing an experience of becoming. At UCLA, my imagination narrowed. Everything became organized around 3 outcomes I had carried for years: graduate, move out, build a home of my own. Those goals weren't wrong. They were meaningful, but somewhere along the way, I compressed the entire experience into arrival. I became so focused on reaching the finish line that I stopped asking what kind of person I was becoming while I was running the race. And I think that's something many of us do. We become so consumed by becoming successful that we rarely stop to ask what success is actually asking us to carry. Because achievement changes more than our circumstances. It changes our environments, it changes our relationships, it changes our responsibilities, it changes how people see us. And sometimes it even changes the stories we've been telling ourselves for years. And when all of those things begin shifting at once, something else often rises to the surface. Not because success created it, because success exposed it. I didn't have language for that at the time. I simply knew that somewhere beneath the excitement of finally arriving, another experience had quietly begun. Pressure. Not the kind of pressure that came from professors or assignments, something deeper. A pressure that seemed to emerge from inside. It was subtle at first, almost invisible. But looking back now, I think it was the beginning of one of the most important lessons of my life. Because sometimes achievement doesn't answer the identity questions we've been carrying. Sometimes it reveals the ones we've been avoiding. And that realization would change everything I thought I'd understand about ambition, transformation, and ultimately why people return to old versions of themselves even after their biggest breakthroughs. That pressure didn't arrive all at once. If it had, I probably would have recognized it. I might have called someone. I might have slowed down. I might have admitted that something inside me was beginning to strain. But pressure rarely announces itself that way. More often, it accumulates quietly, settling into your life one expectation at a time until what once felt manageable begins feeling impossibly heavy. And looking back, I don't think my breakdown began in my dorm room. I think it began long before I ever understood what I was carrying. When I arrived at UCLA, everything around me felt surreal. I had spent years imagining those buildings, those walkways, those classrooms, and suddenly I wasn't picturing them anymore. I was walking through them. There is something profoundly disorienting about living inside a future you once only visited in your imagination. At first, it feels exhilarating. Then, almost without noticing, imagination gives way to reality, and reality begins asking different things of you than imagination ever did. The dream had finally arrived, but dreams rarely ask us, who are we while we're pursuing them? They ask that question after the arrival. And that distinction has become incredibly important to me. When people imagine success, they often imagine the moment of arrival. They picture opening the acceptance letter, walking across the graduation stage, getting the promotion, buying the house, hearing the congratulations. Those moments matter. They deserve to be celebrated, but they are moments. Life, on the other hand, is lived in what comes after them. I had imagined getting into UCLA countless times. I had not imagined waking up every morning wondering whether I belonged there. I had imagined graduating. I had not imagined the emotional life required to inhabit that experience with peace. There is a difference between rehearsing achievement and rehearsing identity. I had unknowingly rehearsed one far more than the other. As the academic year continued, I found myself becoming increasingly organized around outcomes. My attention narrowed almost completely around a vision I had been carrying for years. Graduate from UCLA, move out my mother's house, build a home of my own. Those three goals became almost like coordinates directing every decision I made. They gave me purpose, but they also compressed my life into a future I was desperately trying to reach. The strange thing about living that way is that you slowly stop inhabiting the present. Every day becomes valuable only because it moves you closer to tomorrow. Every accomplishment becomes meaningful only because it points toward the next one, the next outcome. Without realizing it, I had begun measuring my life almost entirely through progress. The body has a remarkable way of noticing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Mine certainly did. During my first quarter, my spring quarter, something inside of me finally gave way. I had a breakdown in my dorm room. Even now, I choose that word carefully because I don't think there is another one that tells the truth as honestly. It wasn't simply that I felt overwhelmed. It wasn't an unusual, difficult week. It wasn't a temporary discouragement passing through. Something fractured beneath the weight of pressure I had not yet learned to name. Emotionally, mentally, psychologically, I collapsed in a way I had never experienced before. I reached a place where I contemplated into my life, and there are few sentences I write with more care than that one, because I know there are people listening who have stood frighteningly close to that same edge. What has stayed with me all these years is not only that it happened, it's where it happened. It happened in the very place I believed would finally change my life. And that contradiction haunted me for a long time. Because somewhere deep inside, I had quietly accepted an equation that many of us inherited without realizing it. Achievement equals peace. Reach the goal, become enough, solve the uncertainty, arrive. But life interrupted that equation in the most unexpected way imaginable. I had reached the place I once thought belonged to other people, and I was falling apart there. For years, I wondered how those two realities could exist together. How could the greatest achievement of my life coincide with the one of the deepest collapse? And eventually, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't why success failed to save me. The question was what success revealed once I could no longer blame my circumstances. That changed everything. Because before UCLA, there was always another explanation available. Maybe I would feel different once I get accepted. Maybe my confidence would come after I proved myself. Maybe belonging would arrive with achievement. Maybe peace was waiting on the other side of accomplishment. And those explanations quietly disappeared once I arrived. The dream had happened, which meant the questions that remained could no longer be answered by another achievement. Psychologists have a phrase called cognitive dissonance, and it, at its simplest, it describes the tension we experience when two realities we believe should fit together no longer do. Our minds naturally seek consistency. When our experience contradicts our expectations, something inside of us begins searching for an explanation. Looking back, I think I was living inside a profound form of that tension. Part of me believed, you made it. Another part quietly asked, then why doesn't it feel the way you imagined? And both realities existed simultaneously. Neither canceled the other. And that matters because I think many people experience cognitive dissonance after breakthrough and mistake it for failure. They assume that because success didn't produce the emotional resolution they expected, something must be wrong with them. And I no longer believe that. I think that tension often signals something much more important. And sometimes achievement doesn't create an identity crisis. Sometimes it exposes one that was already there. That distinction changed the trajectory of my life because I stopped interpreting my breakdown as proof that I had failed. I began wondering whether it had revealed something I had never been able to see while I was still climbing. And if that was true, then perhaps collapse wasn't interrupting the story. Perhaps it was introducing the deeper one. When I look back now, I don't see my breakdown as the end of something. I see it as the beginning of observation. That may sound strange because we often imagine collapse producing instant clarity. We picture one defining moment where everything suddenly makes sense, where the lesson arrives neatly packaged inside the pain. That wasn't my experience. My life didn't become clearer after my breakdown. If anything, it became more confusing. The questions became louder than the answers. I still graduated. I still walked across the stage. I still completed what years earlier had felt impossible. From the outside, my life continued moving in the direction I had already planned, or always planned. Internally, however, something had changed. Achievement no longer felt like an answer. It felt like an interruption. I couldn't explain why. All I knew was that the peace I expected to arrive with accomplishment had never arrived. And that realization stayed with me longer after graduation. A few weeks later, I left for a study abroad program in Paris, France. And from the outside, it looked like the kind of experience many people dream about. I was walking through one of the most beautiful cities in the world, surrounded by history, art, architecture, and possibility. It should have felt expansive. In many ways it was, but beauty has a way of exposing something we don't often talk about. A change in scenery is not the same as a change in identity. So you can cross an ocean and still carry the same emotional architecture you left home with. I know that because I did. And while I was seeing new places, my relationship with my boyfriend was becoming increasingly strained. The emotional exhaustion I carried from the breakdown hadn't disappeared simply because my surrounding had changed. It traveled with me. And looking back, Paris became another reminder that environments can expand your experiences, but they cannot do the work of reorganizing identity for you. When I returned home, I was still trying to finish my final quarter at UCLA. I asked my mother if my boyfriend could stay with us while I completed my schooling, because if I'm honest, I didn't feel emotionally steady after everything that had happened. I thought his presence might create stability during a season where I desperately needed it. Instead, it introduced another layer of pressure. Tension developed between my mother, her husband, my boyfriend, and me. And suddenly, academic stress was no longer the only thing I was carrying. Relationship strain, family conflict, physical exhaustion, and emotional fragility all began occupying the same space. Pressure wasn't coming from one direction anymore, it was arriving from every direction at once. Then, during the final week of my last quarter, I was in a car accident. Even now, I hesitate to make that moment symbolic, because not every difficult event is a metaphor. But looking back, it felt as though every part of my life was converging into one unavoidable question: how much longer could I keep outrunning what was happening inside of me? Somehow, I finished. I still finished. I still graduated. I received the diploma. The goal I had carried for years was finally complete, but completion did not produce resolution. That may have been the most surprising lesson of all, because I realized something that contradicted almost everything I had believed growing up. Achievement can produce outcomes without producing peace. Those are not the same thing. For a long time, I thought my ambition was simply ambition. I admired people who worked hard. I believed in discipline. I believed in perseverance. I assumed the force driving me forward was obvious. And years later, I realized I had mistaken the vehicle for the driver. Ambition was carrying something much deeper. As I began reflecting on those years, another pattern slowly emerged. I wasn't only pursuing accomplishments, I was pursuing recognition. And I wanted professors who believed in me, peers who respected me, conversations where I felt seen, moments where someone else's acknowledgement could quiet questions I hadn't yet learned to answer for myself. There's nothing wrong with wanting recognition or to be recognized. We all want to know that our lives matter. We all want to feel seen, but recognition becomes dangerous when it quietly accepts responsibility for something it was never designed to provide. It cannot become identity. No amount of praise can permanently answer the question of who you are. No degree can carry that weight. No achievement can carry that either. And yet, I think many of us unknowingly ask achievement to do exactly that. We ask it to prove we're enough, to prove we belong, to prove we matter, to prove we were always capable. An achievement wasn't simply changing my circumstances. It was carrying questions I hadn't realized I was asking. That observation led me somewhere I wasn't expecting. I began wondering whether some of my ambitions had been inherited before they had been examined. College college had always been presented to me as the obvious step. Teachers encouraged it, society celebrated it, success seemed to follow a familiar sequence. Go to school, earn a degree, build a career, buy the house, take care of your family. None of those things are inherently wrong. Many people build meaningful lives that way. But somewhere along the journey, I had stopped asking a different question. I had started asking a different question. Whose identity was I living? That that question unsettled me because the answer wasn't simple. I eventually realized something I had resisted admitting for years. I didn't actually love school. What I loved was learning. Those aren't the same thing. Some of my happiest moments had never happened inside of classrooms. They happened behind cameras, inside creative projects, on film sets, working with artists, imagining stories, building something that didn't exist before. The arts had always felt like home in a way traditional education never quite had. School became a vehicle, creativity was the identity. And looking back, I can see the tension much more clearly than I could then. I was succeeding inside one identity while quietly belonging to another. And that realization wasn't a rejection of education, it was the beginning of authorship. It was the first time I seriously questioned whether every ambition I carried had actually originated with me, or whether some of them had been borrowed long before I ever chose them. And that question would eventually reshape everything I understood about identity. But at the same time, it simply left me with another realization I couldn't ignore. Perhaps the greatest thing achievement had exposed wasn't my weakness, it was my unconsciousness. Because until then, I knew how to pursue goals. I knew how to persevere. I knew how to keep moving. What I, what I did not yet understand was what had been moving me. And it took me years to understand that my breakdown wasn't asking me to abandon ambition. It was asking me to examine it. And for a long time, I thought those were the same things. I assumed that if striving had led me to collapse, then perhaps striving itself had been the problem. But as I continued reflecting on that season, I began seeing something much more nuanced. Ambition hadn't broken me. Ambition had simply carried me far enough that the identity underneath it could no longer remain hidden. That realization changed the way I think about success. I no longer see achievement as something that creates identity. I see it as something that reveals the identity already operating beneath the surface. Before a breakthrough, we often imagine that one more opportunity, one more accomplishment, or one more milestone will finally answer the questions we've been carrying about ourselves. We tell ourselves that once we arrive, uncertainty will disappear, and that belonging will finally feel natural, that peace will finally settle in. And sometimes it does, but sometimes achievement removes the last explanation standing between us and ourselves. Before I got into UCLA, it was easy to believe that the life I wanted was simply waiting on acceptance. And once I arrived, that explanation disappeared, and the opportunity was no longer missing. The dream had become reality, and because the external barrier had been removed, I was left face to face with something I had never fully examined. Who was I underneath everything I had achieved? And that question didn't arrive because I failed. It arrived because I succeeded. And I think many people have experienced some version of this without having language for it. And someone spends years building a career only to discover they don't know who they are apart from their work. Someone finally gets married and realizes marriage cannot answer questions of self-worth. Someone builds a successful business and quietly wonders why they still feel restless. Someone reaches financial security and discovers anxiety made the journey with them. The circumstances change, the identity often doesn't. And when those two realities collide, people frequently assume something has gone wrong. I don't think something has gone wrong. I think something has become visible. That's an entirely different conversation. One of the things I appreciate about psychology is that it gives us language for patterns that otherwise feel deeply personal. Cognitive dissonance helps explain why contradictory realities create tension. Self-concept research reminds us that human beings work continuously to maintain a coherent sense of who they believe themselves to be. When our external lives begin moving faster than our internal identities, those systems don't always synchronize immediately. And sometimes the gap becomes impossible to ignore. And looking back, I think that's why UCLA exposed in me. That's what I think UCLA exposed in me. My circumstances had expanded. my identity was still catching up. That doesn't mean the achievement was a mistake. It means growth had reached a depth that circumstances alone could no longer accomplish. I often think about something that emerged much later as I continue studying these patterns. Achievement changes circumstances. Identity determines whether those circumstances become home. That sentence didn't exist while I was living through UCLA. It emerged years after as I kept asking why some breakthroughs seemed to stabilize people while others quietly unraveled them. And I realized the answer wasn't usually found in the achievement itself. It was found in the structure of identity underneath the achievement. That's why I no longer believe transformation is primarily about reaching new places. It's about becoming someone who can live there. And that distinction eventually became one of the central ideas behind Become Unreturnable. The book the book didn't begin because I wanted to write about motivation. It began because I couldn't stop asking a question. Why do people return to old versions of themselves after genuine breakthrough? Why do people experience healing, success, achievement, manifestation, or significant personal growth only to find themselves pulled back toward familiar ways of thinking, feeling, and living? For years, I assumed the answer had something to do with discipline or mindset or effort. What I eventually came to believe was something different. Perhaps people don't return because they wanted less. Perhaps they return because the identity capable of sustaining the change had never been fully reorganized. And that idea didn't arrive all at once. It arrived through fragments. A breakdown in the dorm room, a semester in Paris, family tension that followed me home, sleeping on a couch with everything I own in grocery and duffel bags, watching patterns instead of chasing outcomes, asking different questions than I had asked before. And piece by piece, those fragments begin forming a framework. And looking back now, I don't regret getting into UCLA. I don't regret working hard. I don't regret dreaming big. If anything, those experiences gave me the questions that shaped the rest of my life. Because sometimes the greatest gift achievement offers isn't confirmation, it's exposure. It reveals the places where identity is still asking to grow. And as difficult as that can be, I now think that's one of the most hopeful realizations a person can have. Because if achievement exposes what ambition was hiding, then exposure isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of authorship. It's the moment you stop asking achievement to answer questions it was never designed to answer. It's the moment you begin asking a different question, not what else can I accomplish? What else can I accomplish? But who am I becoming underneath everything I'm pursuing? And I think that's one of the most important questions any one of us can ask. Because the answer won't simply shape your next achievement. It will shape what you're able to sustain once you get there. So I'd like to leave you with a reflection. Think about the greatest achievement of your life so far. Not the one you're still hoping for, the one you've already experienced. And ask yourself this: what did that achievement reveal about me that I couldn't see while I was chasing it? Not what it gave you, not what it changed around you. What did it uncover within you? I'd love for you to spend some time with that question before rushing into the next goal, because sometimes the most important work doesn't begin before the breakthrough. Sometimes it begins after it. And perhaps that's where real transformation has been waiting all along. I don't want this conversation to leave you discouraged. If achievement exposed something painful in your life, that doesn't mean the achievement failed. It means it succeeded in revealing something that could finally be transformed. And that's hopeful. because identity can change. The questions that surfaced after your breakthrough aren't evidence that you were never meant to have the breakthrough. They're evidence that you've arrived at the place where deeper work begins. And I think many people spend years trying to recreate the feeling they had before the collapse because they mistake collapse for the ending of the story. I no longer see it that way. Sometimes collapse is the doorway into authorship. Sometimes it's the first moment you stop asking, how do I achieve more? And start asking, how do I become someone who can live differently? Those are different questions. One chases another accomplishment, the other reorganizes a life. If you've ever experienced what we've talked about today, if achievement exposed something you weren't expecting, I hope you don't rush past it. Sit with it, study it, because it may be telling you something achievement alone never could. And if that's where you find yourself, that's exactly the journey I explored throughout Become Unreturnable. Not how to achieve more, but how to become someone the past can no longer organize.